There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Yeshua by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know you're a teacher come from Elohim, for no one can do these signs that you do unless Elohim is with him. Yeshua answered and said to him, Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of Elohim, he cannot see the kingdom of Elohim. Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? Yeshua answered, Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of Elohim. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, You must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who's born of the Spirit. Nicodemus answered and said to him, How can these things be? Yeshua answered and said to him, Are you the teacher of Israel, and you do not know these things? My name is Norman Willis. How many of us in the Hebrew Roots movement don't understand these things? I was speaking recently at a group, and they were telling me that hearing the voice of Yahweh is the same as reading from the Torah. And that's when I understood that we have a problem. So that's why this presentation is on Spirit and Truth, hearing Yahweh's voice. In Exodus chapter 15 and verse 26, Yahweh is speaking to Moshe, the leader of the children of Israel. And he says, If you diligently heed the voice of Yahweh your Elohim, and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you, which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you. I'd like to notice here, there's two different things. There's heeding the voice of Yahweh our Elohim and giving ear to his commandments. Two separate things. We're going to see this as a hidden theme. It's going to show up time and again. If we go to Exodus chapter 19 and verse 5, he says, Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. He's talking about the Torah. Two separate things. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Come to Numbers chapter 14 and verse 22. He says, Because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. So this is an important thing, that we not only keep his commandments, but also that we hear and obey his voice. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 29. He's speaking about when we've come into the distress of the latter days. He says, But from there you will seek Yahweh your Elohim, and you will find him if you seek him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. Partial searching's not going to cut it. He says, when you are in distress and all these things come upon you in the latter days, well, we're in the latter days. He says, when you turn to Yahweh your Elohim and obey his voice. We're in the latter days, brothers and sisters. We need to be turning to Yahweh or Elohim. We need to be hearing his voice. We need to understand there's two separate things. There's the commandments and there's obeying his voice. What is it to obey his voice? In Deuteronomy 8 and verse 20 it says, As the nations which Yahweh destroys before you, so shall you perish because you would not be obedient to the voice of Yahweh your Elohim. A lot of the Messianics and Hebrew roots people I know don't even know what it is to hear Yahweh's voice, much less be obedient to it. Is this what we want? Do we want to be destroyed? This is what Yahweh promises to us in his Torah. This is what we read every year, that we would not be obedient to the voice of Yahweh our Elohim. Therefore, we will be destroyed in the distress of the latter days. That's not what we want. Let's keep reading and understanding. We come to Deuteronomy 13 and verse 4. It says, "You shall walk after Yahweh your Elohim and fear him, and keep his commandments and obey his voice." Two separate requirements. You shall keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and hold fast to him. Let's come to Deuteronomy 26 and verse 17. "Today you have proclaimed Yahweh to be your Elohim, that you will walk in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments and his judgments." So we're talking about all the physical things, the requirements of the Torah, and that you will obey his voice. What is this voice? What is the voice? We know what the commandments are, not that everyone's keeping them, but what is this voice that we're supposed to be not only hearing, but we're supposed to be diligently obeying his voice so that we can escape the suffering and the tragedy of the latter days? Let's keep reading. Let's come to 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 11. We're speaking about Elijah or Eliyahu. "And then he said to Eliyahu, Go out and stand on the mountain before Yahweh. And behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountain and broke the rocks in pieces before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice." What is this still, small voice? You'll hear people talk about it sometimes. It's not very well understood. People, especially in the Hebrew roots movement, we become Pharisees. Everything is a checklist to us. We've got our check, we got our Sabbath, we got our festivals, we got our commandments, we got our beards, we got our tzitzit. We've forgotten all about the spiritual component, and then we can't understand why the Christian world accuses us of being basically Pharisees. Well, I think for a lot of us, I think the accusation fits, the shoe fits, we should wear it. And then let's learn how to put on the other shoe so we can walk our way out of this mess. In Proverbs, in chapter 8, it speaks to this whole thing. Proverbs chapter 8, starting in verse 1, it says, "Does not wisdom cry out, and understanding lift up her voice?" Are we listening for the voice of wisdom? Are we listening for the voice of understanding? Are we being diligent about these things? We're going to see this is a very important thing. Does not wisdom cry out and understanding lift up her voice? She takes her stand at the top of the high hill, beside the way where the paths meet. Let's just visualize. She cries out by the gates, at the entry of the city, at the entrance of the doors. "To you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. Counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I am understanding. I have strength. By me kings reign, and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles, all the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me." Are we seeking her? It says, "Now therefore listen to me, my children," verse 32. "Therefore listen to me, my children, for blessed are those who keep my ways." Do we want to be blessed? "Hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it. How many of us in the Hebrew roots movement disdain the voice of wisdom, disdain the voice of Yahweh? We don't even know what it is. We've never even heard of it. No one's teaching on it. Why? We talk about in the fivefold ministry teaching. There's a lot of vendors teaching a lot of things, but we're not learning and growing in the knowledge. We're not learning and growing and becoming more like Yeshua, who breathes in the fear of Yahweh Elohim, it says in Isaiah. We're not learning to become like Yeshua. We're learning lots of things about Yeshua. We're learning lots of checklist requirements in the Torah. But are we hearing his voice? People talk all the time about a personal one-on-one relationship with Yahweh. Are we hearing our Father's voice? For those of you who are fathers or mothers, you have children, don't you want your children to listen for your voice? Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my doors. The visualization here is that we're waiting for wisdom to come out of her habitation, her abode. And she's going to post, like they used to do in the old days. She's going to post a notice by her doors for those who are seeking her, for those who are paying attention to what wisdom says. Blessed is the man who listens for me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my doors. Whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from Yahweh. Don't we want favor from Yahweh? But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul, and all those who hate me love death. Proverbs 9, verse 1. Wisdom has built her house. She's hewn out her 7 pillars. She's slaughtered her meat. She's mixed her wine. She's also furnished her table. She's sent out her maidens. She cries out from the highest places of the city. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. As for him who lacks understanding, she says to him, come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine I've mixed. Forsake foolishness and live, and go in the way of understanding. Do we understand that he has a voice? Do we understand that wisdom has a voice? We should be listening each moment. We should be listening for his voice. We should be listening. What is the Spirit saying to his people? In Isaiah 30 in verse 21, it says, your ears, if you're listening, if we are listening, it says, your ears shall hear a word behind you, saying, this is the way, walk in it. Whenever you turn to the right hand, or whenever you turn to the left. How many times, I could tell you stories that would probably sound crazy to you, but just walking along the way, and you just get that gut feeling that you're listening, and it just seems like turn down this alley, or go this way, or don't go straight ahead, go off to the right, or go straight ahead. There was a gentleman that I know worked for a company, and he just got this feeling that he was supposed to go up to this woman and just say, and he was using the wrong names, he's a Christian man, he wasn't a Hebrew roots person, but he just kept having this nagging feeling. He was supposed to go up to this woman and just say, Jesus loves you. And he didn't know why. There was the wrong name. But he didn't know why he was supposed to do it. But he just kept having this nagging feeling that that's what he was supposed to do. So he went up and did it. He went up and spoke to her. And she broke down and cried. Right? He just said, look, I don't know what this is about, but I just feel like I'm supposed to tell you that Jesus loves you. And she just broke down and cried right there. And she said she was going to commit suicide later that day. But she was so glad for that message, and she became saved, and she continued to live. So this is the importance. This is the kind of a thing that we need to understand. Wisdom has a real, literal voice. Yahweh has a voice. Yeshua's voice, we're supposed to be, my sheep hear my voice. We're supposed to be hearing and obeying his voice. We need to be listening for a word behind us, saying, this is the way, walk in it. Moment by moment, are we supposed to say this? Are we supposed to say that? This is the kind of a thing we're supposed to be tuning in so that his Spirit can live and work through us. That's the requirement. It's not just that we keep Sabbath and festivals. If we're not transformed, if we don't become spiritual beings, then what good is anything? Is this just a test to see who can live by a checklist? Who's willing to obey a checklist? If there's not a spiritual transformation going on inside. Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 23 says, but this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and then I will be your Elohim, and you shall be my people, and walk in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you. It says, yet they did not obey or incline their ear. So they're supposed to be listening, but they did not obey his commandments, and they did not incline their ear to obey his voice. But they followed the counsels and the dictates of their evil hearts and went backward and not forward. So those of us in the Hebrew Roots movement, we understand in Matthew 5 and verse 17, Yeshua says, do not think that I came to abolish the Torah or the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish them, but only in fulfillment of the part of the prophecies that are in them. But then in verse 20 he says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I'm a Hebrew Roots person. I've been in the Hebrew Roots movement since 1999. I'm doing the very best I can to get the knowledge of Hebrew Roots out there. I mean to say, if we don't understand his voice, Yeshua says, for unless I say to you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, forgive me, weren't the Pharisees keeping the Sabbath, keeping the festivals? Didn't the Pharisees tithe of the mint and the anise and the cumin? Didn't the Pharisees do all sorts of things? So how is our righteousness going to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees unless we undergo this kind of a spiritual transformation, such that we're now listening carefully, moment by moment, for a still small voice in our ears behind us, saying, don't go that way, don't say this, don't say that. I want you to go this way, and I want you to say this over here to that person. Unless we become clay in his hands to that extent, unless we become empty vessels for him to move through, unless we become a tool in his hand, how have we truly laid down our lives? How have we gone through a spiritual transformation? So, in Matthew chapter 21, starting in verse 43, he says, therefore, he's speaking to the Pharisees who don't know what it is to show fruits of the Spirit. Why? Because they're not hearing the Spirit. They don't have his Spirit in them. He says, therefore, I say to you, the kingdom of Elohim will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruits of it. What fruits? We're talking about the fruits of the Spirit. Well, unless we have the Spirit in us, and people say, well, I accepted Yeshua, therefore I have his Spirit. Okay, well, no, there's a multiple part process we need to understand is going on here. Okay, just using myself as an example, maybe not the best person to use. I got called to repentance on June 6, 1999. Now, I wasn't filled with his Spirit until it was either September or October of 1999. So I accepted Yeshua in June, and I didn't receive his Spirit until September or October. Now, there's a lot of us, and we'll talk about this in more detail in another place, but becoming saved or being called to repentance, whichever one you choose, and being filled with his Spirit, these are two separate events, two separate things. I remember for me when it happened, it was like someone turned on a power switch. It was just this energy. I can't explain it better than that. It was just felt energized. It was as if, so we know we're supposed to be immersed in water. It was as if I was immersed in this spirit, and it just, his spirit, just, I became bathed in it. You'll know it if it's happened to you. Well, even after that, then I learned about the Torah in December of 1999. And then I began learning about his voice in 2000. Didn't really get it. Learned some more in 2002. Still didn't really get it. Learned more in 2006. Still not getting it. I was the kind of a person, I was sort of running ahead of Yahweh. We'll talk about that some other time. We'll talk in another place about the concept of brokenness. I didn't understand what it was to be broken until about 2009. So we become born. So I was born again in 1999. I was born of the Spirit in September of 1999. I learned about the Torah, but didn't really understand the concept of his voice or brokenness until about 2009. It's a very, very important transition that those of us who really want to obey Elohim have to go through. It's not that we just get saved and it's a one-time event and we're done. It's not that we learn about Yeshua and it's a one-time event and we're done. It's not that we learn about the Torah and it's a one-time event. Or it's not that we're filled with the Spirit and it's a one-time event and we're done. It's a continuous learning process. And we know, we just saw earlier in this presentation, we have to be continually obedient. We have to be obeying his voice. We're listening for this voice, the still small voice of Yahweh or Elohim, if we want to escape the trials and the tribulation and the judgment that's going to come upon us and our people in the latter days. That's why we're talking about this right now. So again, let's go to Matthew 21, starting in verse 43. So Yeshua is talking to the Pharisees, and he's saying, therefore I say to you, I know you keep Sabbath, I know you keep festivals, I know you tithe of the mint and the anise and the cumin, you do all these things, but I'm telling you, the kingdom of Elohim will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruits of the Spirit. And he says, whoever falls on this stone, referring to Yeshua, will be broken. Meaning he's got to have brokenness, something we need in the Hebrew roots movement. But upon whomever it falls, it will grind him into a powder. So, brothers and sisters, if we don't learn about brokenness, if we don't mirror and model brokenness in our daily lives, if this isn't our constant goal, if it's not our constant striving, then we're not going to escape the tribulation of the latter days. Yeshua speaks of these things in different terms, but it's the same message. It's the same message. John 15, starting in verse 4. Yeshua says, abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. Well, what's he talking about? I talk to people in the Hebrew roots movement. I say, what's Yeshua talking about? I says, oh, well, we just need to believe on him. Well, no, we do need to believe on him. But if we just need to believe on him, what does he mean we have to abide in him? What is it to abide in him? What's he talking about here? Verse 5, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. He says, but without me, you can do nothing. What's he talking about? He says, if anyone does not abide in me, he's cast out as a branch and is withered. And they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they're burned. And people are saying, well, I believe on Yeshua. I'm abiding in him, aren't I? There's nothing more to it than that, right? I believe on him. Oh, well, I remember being energized. I remember being filled with the Spirit, but I'm not listening for the sound of his voice. Well, so verse 7, he says, if you abide in me. He's just told us, abide in me and I in you, and if you don't, you're cast out as a branch and are burned. And then he says, well, if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, he says, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. Now, it's kind of a trick. Okay, it's a tricky passage. He's not saying here, he's not saying, oh, well, if you believe in me, you can ask for whatever you want. Prosperity doctrine, prosperity gospel, whatever you want. A Lexus, Cadillac, Bentley, a new house, lots of car, money, fame, fortune, whatever. This is not cutting a deal with the devil. This is the opposite thing. He's not saying if you will believe on Yeshua, then you can ask whatever you want. You're going to get whatever you want. What he's saying is, if my words abide in you, then you're going to ask what I desire. Because it's no longer your words abiding in you. It's now my words abiding in you. So you're going to ask what I desire, and then it's going to be done for you. That's really what he's saying here. Only the way it's worded is to provide a stumbling block and a trip up for those of us who aren't being diligent about we have to remember it's a narrow and afflicted path. We're told the way is broad that leads to destruction. I think what a lot of us forget is that he's speaking to his followers in that passage. He's saying, of all of you, my followers, the way is broad that leads to destruction. There's a narrow and afflicted pathway that's going to lead to life, and very few of you are going to find it. We need to remember that. So Yeshua, in verse 8, he's saying, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit of the Spirit, and so you will be my disciples. What's he talking about? What he's saying is, if you want to glorify my Father, empty yourself of you. Let it no longer be about you. Just tune your ears to the spiritual frequency. Tune your ears to Yahweh. Tune into him. Listen for the voice behind you saying, this is the way. Walk in it. Whenever you turn to the right hand, whenever you rise up, whenever you lay down, whenever you're on the phone talking to your friend, whenever you're writing an email, are you writing what you want to write? Or are you being the tool for Yahweh's Spirit to write an email to your friend what Yahweh wants you to write? Are you being willful? Are you doing what you want to do? Or are you listening for Yahweh's voice and listening for what he wants you to do? That's the difference. So if we're to lay down our lives, a living sacrifice, are we laying down our lives, or are we just saying we're laying down our lives and really we're doing anything that we want? This is the difference. Because how his Father is glorified, how our Father is glorified, is that we lay down our lives. We lay down what we want. Now we're listening continually for what he wants. That's what it's all about. That's the spiritual transformation that he's talking about. John chapter 4, the woman of the well, starting in verse 23. He's speaking to the woman of the well, and Yeshua says, but the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. He says, Elohim is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Well, do we worship him in spirit and in truth? We know from Scripture that in Psalms 119 it says, thy Torah is truth, your law is truth. Are we worshiping in spirit and in truth? This is the requirement. This is what we have to do here. Galatians 5 and verse 19, he says, now the works, Paul says, the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness. Think about the Hebrew roots movement here, folks, brothers and sisters. Idolatry. Okay, how many people do we have worshiping the hexagram? How many people do we have worshiping the menorah fish? How many people do we have worshiping things other than the invisible Elohim? Sorcery, hatred. How many hatreds are there in the Hebrew roots movement? Contentions? Do we have any of those in the Hebrew roots movement? Jealousies? I can think of several jealousies. Outbursts of wrath? When was the last time you saw an outburst of wrath go on in the Hebrew roots movement? Do we understand the requirement is to take heed to our spirit? We have to continually be taking heed to our spirit. Outbursts of wrath. This is not of his spirit. Well, if it's not of his spirit, then whose spirit is it of? Is it okay that we're not abiding in him? Because if we're abiding in him and his spirit abides in us, are we going to have an outburst of wrath? Selfish ambitions. Is that from him? Dissensions. Do we have any dissensions in the Hebrew roots movement? Heresies. Okay, so what's a heresy? So we're talking about, let's pick something like denial of Yeshua's deity. We have several Messianic ministers who write on the front page of their websites, deny the virgin birth, deny Yeshua's deity. Would that qualify as a heresy? I think we have a number of heresies in the Hebrew roots movement. And the reason why is because we're not listening for his voice. We're being willful. We're doing what we want. We're not listening for what he wants because we're not being disciples in this movement. So people say, well, I've accepted Yeshua, I've accepted the Spirit, but I don't need to practice any discipline. I can be a disciple without practicing any discipline. Well, how can you be a disciple without practicing any discipline? So verse 21, envy, do we have any of that in the Messianic Hebrew roots movement? Murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I told you beforehand, just as I told you also in times past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of Elohim. Why? Is because they're not being diligent to empty themselves of themselves and be filled with his Spirit from above. We're not being born again, or if we are, we're quenching that Spirit right out of ourselves. It's not good enough. It's not a cleansing sacrifice. It's not laying down your life a living sacrifice unto him, which is what we need to be doing. So verse 22, Shaul says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering. Do we know when we're in the Spirit? Can we tell? Can we tell when we have this good feeling between us and Elohim and good feeling between us and our fellow man, our brothers and sisters? We just know that moment in time when we know that everything is right. Can we maintain that all the time? That's the discipline. That's the walk. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. He says, against such there's no Torah. There's no Torah against these. We can practice these things all the time. In fact, we need to be practicing these things all the time. Verse 24, and those who are Messiahs have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. This is what we've been saying. We're no longer going to be doing what we want. Now we're going to be listening for a voice behind us. What do you want me to say? What do you want me to do? How do you want me to do it? We're no longer living according to our own passions and desires. We're listening for him. Yahweh, Father Yahweh, please show me what you want me to do. He says, if we live in the Spirit, let's also walk in the Spirit. Let's actually do this thing. This is not just something, I believe Yeshua, okay, whatever. Then we're going to gather on Sabbath and festivals and read a little bit and eat a meal and we're done. No. If we live in the Spirit, let's also walk in the Spirit, day by day, moment by moment. Verse 26 says, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. When was the last time at a Hebrew roots festival or gathering you saw someone provoking someone else? It's not about provoking. It's not about envying. It's about walking in love and compassion, gentleness, peacefulness, self-control. I mean, there are times when Yahweh sends his prophets to provoke his people, but there's a difference. This is not it's not provocation of man. It's something the Father directs them to do. Even Yeshua says he has to do what the Father directs him to do. In John chapter 5 and verse 30, Yeshua says, he says, I can of myself do nothing. I can't do anything of myself. He says, as I hear, I judge. And we'll talk about that in another place. Talk about the role of an anointed judge like Samuel and this kind of thing. He says, as I hear, I judge. He's not making up his own mind. He's not making up a mental decision. He's listening for Yahweh to tell him what to do. He says, and my judgment is righteous because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. It's the exact same thing what he's saying. He's saying, I'm not doing my own will here. I'm not a loose cannon running around. I'm listening all the time. I'm listening. It says, Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel. What are we listening to? Rock and roll? No. Hear, O Israel. What are we listening? We're hearing the voice of the Spirit. We're listening for our Father. So that we can do not our own will, but the will of our Father who sends us. And this is not a burdensome, this is a joyful thing to know that you are in such close communion with your Father. When Yeshua abides in you and you in him. There's such a joy, there's such a peace, there's such a contentment, knowing that you're together with him and that you will be together forever with him. Because if you're not together with him now, why would you be together with him later? I mean, this is the time when we get to show him that we love him enough to put off our own fleshly will and to seek his will for us. Who does he want as a bride? Does he want a bride that's doing her own thing, doing her own will? This is the greatest king ever. Or does he want a bride who's saying, husband, father, show me your will. Elohim, show me your will for me and help me walk in it whenever I turn to the right hand or whenever I turn to the left. It's so important. We have to get this component if we want to escape the punishment in the latter days. In John chapter 8 and verse 47, he says, he who is of Elohim hears Elohim's words. He says, therefore you do not hear because you are not of Elohim. Pharisees got 10 different kinds of mad. Guess what? You say this in the Hebrew Roots movement, guess what people get? They get 10 different kinds of mad. Don't you tell me I'm not Elohim's. I have accepted Yeshua. I keep the commandments. I keep the Sabbath, and I gather, and I eat a meal, and I'm good, right? Guys, we'll talk about that in another place. Giving your life over to his Spirit is what it's all about. And once you've given your life over to his Spirit, then you know how to walk out his commandments in his Spirit. Until we give our lives over to him, how can we really keep his commandments the way he wants us to keep them? It can't possibly work. John 10 and verse 3. Yeshua says, to him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. Do we hear his voice? And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Are we hearing his voice? Are we listening for his voice? Verse 5, he says, yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. And if you are a shepherd working for Yeshua, if there's sheep who don't follow you, and you're speaking his voice, and they're not following you, it's because they're not his sheep. That's the scary part. So, Yahweh's sheep hear Yahweh's voice. Those who are not Yahweh's sheep don't hear Yahweh's voice. And they don't follow other people. John 10 and verse 27, Yeshua says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Now, we need to understand, it's so important that the Torah, the commandments and the statutes and the laws, and Yahweh's voice are two separate things. They go together, two great tastes that go great together, but they're two separate things. And if we're not getting it, then it's not good. We need to understand, we need to have both the testimony and the Torah. We need to have a testimony of Yeshua. John 14 and verse 16. So Yeshua is saying, and I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may abide with you forever. The Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive. Because and I got to tell you, this verse right here, this passage just grieves me, because I can't tell you the number of Hebrew roots believers, and Hebrew roots believers, Messianics, whatever you want to call them, they don't hear his voice. They don't know what the Spirit of truth is. When you speak the truth to them, they can't discern the truth because they're not listening for the truth. Because why? Because they don't have the Spirit of truth. They have not received the Spirit of truth in order for them to be saved. This is a spirit. It's something you pray for. So first you pray to accept Yeshua, then you pray for the indwelling of the Spirit. Once you have his Spirit, you ask him, Father, please send your Spirit of truth to be with me. Let it dwell in me forever. Please help me to put off my own will. Please help me to put off my own flesh. Please help me walk after you. Please, Father, make me an empty vessel. Make me a tool in your hand. Father, please work through me. Fill me up. When I write an email, when I talk on the phone, don't let it be me, Father. Let it be you. Whatever you have for me to do, whether it's ministry, whether it's changing a diaper, whether it's driving a truck, brain surgery, whatever you're doing, Father, direct me, lead me, guide me. We're not all going to be ministers. That's not how it goes. But he has a role for each one of us, and he has a way that his Spirit, he wants to work through us. He says, I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may abide with you forever. The Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive. How many Messianics, even people who call themselves Nazarenes, they can't receive the Spirit of truth because it neither sees him nor knows him. Speaking to his disciples, he says, but you know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. Do we feel his Spirit dwelling in us? Are we able to discern the truth? Verse 15, he says, no longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master's doing. But I've called you friends, for all the things that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. Now notice, John 15 in verse 26, he says, but when the Helper comes, whom I shall send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, he will testify of me. Now, if all we're doing is reading Scripture, how are we going to hear this? The Spirit of truth is testifying. This is true, this is false. This is good, this is bad. You want to do this, you don't want to do that. This is of Yeshua, that's not of Yeshua. How is he testifying? Is he going to write you a note? You're going to get the memo? You're going to get an email? Is he going to send you a text message? What's he going to do here? How is he going to testify of him? Is it going to be in writing, or is it going to be in a still small voice? Are we just going to know if we're listening for wisdom's voice, how is he going to testify of him? John 16 and verse 13, we find out more. Yeshua spends a long time talking about the Spirit of truth. We're talking several chapters here. Is this important? We're spending several chapters talking about the Spirit of truth, the still small voice. What he hears, that's what he speaks. He's not speaking what he thinks. What he hears, O Israel. What he hears, that's what he will speak. John 16 and verse 13, he says, however, when he, meaning the Spirit of truth, has come, or it's a feminine in Aramaic, when he or she, the Spirit of truth, has come, he or she will guide you into all truth. For he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will tell you things to come. Now, think about this. What is Yeshua telling us? He's saying, you and me, we're going to have, because we're being disciples, we're being obedient, we've got discipline, we're no longer doing our own will. The name Willis, it means basically a willful person. It's great. So I got a name means willful. So I got to get rid of the Willis in me. I've got to get rid of the willfulness in me. What's in me, that's bad. Get rid of what's bad. Father, please fill me up with your Spirit. Don't let me decide on my own what to do. Don't let me think my way through what to do. Don't let it be my urges, Father. Let it be you. The Spirit of truth. When the Spirit of truth has come, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own authority. Even the Spirit of truth isn't speaking on its own. He says, but whatever he hears, he will speak. So the Spirit of truth in you is listening, and you're listening, and so it's Elohim speaking through you. And he will tell you things to come. How's he going to tell you? Is he going to sit on there on the sofa and talk to you face to face? Or are we going to be listening for his voice? So, verse 14, he says, he will glorify me. For he will take of what is mine and declare it to you. So he's going to tell you what belongs to Yeshua, what's of Yahweh, what's of Elohim, and what's not. He says, all things that the Father has are mine. Therefore I said, he will take of mine and declare it to you. Now, are we listening? That's the question. John 18 and verse 37, Pilate is speaking to Yeshua, and he says, are you a king then? And Yeshua says, you say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So what are we talking about? Have we prayed to Yahweh? Have we said, Father, please, I need to hear Yeshua's voice, and listen for it moment by moment. And I need to have this Spirit of truth so I can know what's right and what's not right. Because there's all these different interpretations, all these different calendars, all these different everything, all these heresies, all these dissensions, all these fruits of the flesh that are filling up the Messianic movement, the Hebrew roots movement. And I need your Spirit of truth so I can discern what is of the truth. I need to be able to hear your voice, your Spirit, so I can know your truth. So it's so important. So notice he doesn't say everyone who is of the truth believes on him. So he's not saying just because you believe on me, it's good enough. He says everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So if we don't hear his voice, are we of the truth? No. So if we hear his voice, then we know. That's how we know we're of the truth. So in Romans 8 and verse 14, Shaul tells us, he says, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of Elohim, these are the sons of Elohim." So if we're sons of Elohim, we're led by the Spirit. But how are we led? I mean, we know we're led by the Spirit, but are we led by the Spirit just because we believe there's a Spirit, or are we listening for the Spirit? Are we being filled with His Spirit? All through the prophets, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, it speaks of times when His people would receive more of His Spirit. Is that something we can do? Can we become more in tune with Him and His Spirit? Can we pray for the infilling of His Spirit, that we would hear His voice and follow His Spirit at all times? Or do we think that's crazy and over the top? So the sons of Elohim are those who are led by the Spirit of Elohim and, not surprisingly, show the fruits of His Spirit and not the fruits of the flesh. So we're told we don't know another man's heart, but we are allowed to discern the spirits because we're allowed to discern the fruit. And the fruit tells us what the Spirit is. And either it's His Spirit, we may not know what the other spirit is. We might, but either it's of Him, it's of His Spirit, or it's not of His Spirit. In Revelation 3 and verse 20, Yeshua says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and dine with him, and he and me." Have we had that experience? To him who overcomes what? Overcomes the flesh, overcomes his own willfulness, overcomes his own willpower, his own thinking. To him who overcomes his flesh, by way of my Spirit, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame my flesh and sat down with my Father on His throne. Verse 22, he says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the assemblies." Brothers and sisters, I pray that we will all learn more about how to hear and obey His voice together. Amen.